Hello, my name is Stella Hryniuk. I'm a retired professor of Ukrainian history at the University of Manitoba, and I've been teaching Ukrainian and Ukrainian Canadian history for many years. Now I'm just enjoying being a volunteer at places like Oseredok, where Ukrainian Canadian culture is being preserved, and it's a culture I know pretty well. I wanted to talk today about immigration, though. I want to be kind of looking at this from the perspective of history, and just to give you an idea of who the Ukrainians in Canada are. So I think I'll start with a little bit of history. Ukrainians in Canada are the product of three immigrations. There was the first wave, which came between 1891 and 1914. And we're told that there were something like 170,000 immigrants with that wave. Then there was a second wave that came in the 1920s, between about 1925 and 1939, who were a smaller wave, about 65,000. And the third wave came after the Second World War, 1947 to about 1952. They were the smallest group of all, only 35,000. Basically, they all come from the same place. They came from the part of Ukraine that is Western Ukraine, and there were two provinces that really were the basic kind of land from which they came, called Galicia and Bukovina. And those two provinces, when the first wave started, were provinces of the Austrian Empire. Now that's been gone for a long time, but before the First World War, that was where they were located. The second wave also came from there, but they were the immigrants after a war, so they were different from the first wave. And the third wave also came after the Second World War, so they were different from the first and the second. But the land that they came from was pretty much those same two provinces, Bukovina and Galicia. So when we talk about immigration, we usually talk about the push factors and the pull factors. So the first thing I wanted to say about the first wave was the pull factors, because everybody who lives in Canada knows that Canada has grown since Confederation in population, and the pull factors for immigration, which is what we're all are, what Canadians all are, have been different at different times. Basically, though, immigration came because of economic need. Canada needed people. Canada still needs people. Today we need people. So what would it look like in the 1880s, 1890s? Canada had been formed. It was a confederation. There was a railway from coast to coast, CPR, and the economy was beginning to come around from there'd been a bit of a depression in the 1880s. But now there was a great demand in the world for wheat, and Canada had wonderful land. Western Canada was rich and needing people to grow crops to export. So Canada and its immigration officers began to think about where to get more people after 1890. A couple of people's names, I'm just going to mention them from time to time. The first one was the Minister of Immigration called Clifford. In 1896, he got this idea that we had to really put on some pressure to get some immigrants. So he and his agents set up a kind of network of people who would promote Canada in the homeland of the Ukrainians. Not only the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians were kind of a target because he thought they would make really good immigrants. So the pull was from the Canadian side was sort of the propaganda that Canada was great for farmers, and there was an offer of a quarter section of land for a $10 fee, which was a tremendous offer for people who were farmers like the Ukrainians were. The other thing was that there was kind of a deal made between the government and the railway companies and the steamship companies to give them commissions for everybody that they brought in. So that was the pull. Now, the push factors for Ukrainians before the First World War, also basically economic, but I'll describe the people too, so you know that the push was really individual. There was no pressure from Canada or from anybody else for people to move, except if they wanted to. The first wave has often been misinterpreted as kind of a poor, hungry, suffering people, which my research has gone a long way to disprove. They were people who were land hungry. They wanted land. They had small farms, 10, 12 acres, which they farmed intensively and were doing very well. The problem was they couldn't expand. The land was limited. They were growing grain, gardens, all was going well, but they simply could not expand. They were willing, energetic, wanted to come as families, young families, villagers, risk takers, basically. And the push factor for them too was a man whose name was Dr. Joseph Oleski. He was a agriculture professor. So he had traveled to Canada in 1895, saw the land, said, "This is good. This is where Ukrainians should go. They're good farmers. They'll do well here on this open land." So the first immigrants from Galicia, Bukovina started to come in 1891, but the very large wave really came in 1896 through to 1914, with some peak years like 1907, 8, when many a little different immigrant came, were single men who were coming as sojourners. They were going to plan to work here and then go back with the money they earned to buy more land. They were land hungry too. So that first wave came between 1896 and 1914, and as I said already, 170,000 to 200,000 people came. Young farmers, young families, ready to settle down and start farms. I think that I don't need to talk about the travel and the settlement experience too much, because every immigrant group went basically through this. Travel on a ship, railway to Winnipeg. Where it differs a little is that when Ukrainians arrived in Winnipeg, they had to select land, and sometimes land they selected had a different kind of look to it than maybe another farming group would have chosen. The Ukrainians wanted what they really didn't have so much in Galicia, which was access to water, access to the forest, so that they could survive, basically, build their houses while clearing their lands. And it has to be said that Canada's help to the first wave was minimal. They helped them not to die, but there were problems with that. The immigrants had very little cash when they arrived, so they basically lived like campers for the first months, actually, till they could break some land. And they worked very hard to put in about 30 acres. That was when they could actually get patent to their land, after they'd opened and broke 30 acres. So that first group other factors that helped them to settle down, besides the fact that they had chosen lands that were open, was that they were settled in blocks. They settled in blocks around, in Manitoba, Stewartburn, Dauphin, Rossburn, Shoal Lake, that area, and going west in a kind of line that went north, south, from the south of where Stewartburn is to the north, all the way to Edmonton, in a kind of a band, all the way what would be now the Yellowhead River. And as they settled these lands, they started to develop some of the patterns of their homeland that they had left behind. They were lucky in that way that they were living in block settlements. They could see people of their own culture. They did not have the English language. Illiteracy was still a problem. About 50% probably, the research shows, were literate, which isn't very different from the way many European peoples were at that time. They started their social and cultural life by starting building their own churches, building schools for their children, having gatherings, and living their traditions. I can talk a little about my mother's family, which settled in a place called Glenella in 1906. And the stories I have from them are that Christmas was a big feast, even though it was deadly cold, and there was no church service at the time because the priests were itinerant or just none around. And so they had the Christmas meal just like we still do. The table set with a tablecloth over hay, and under the table hay as well, clean hay with oranges and candies under the table, and the tradition being the child seeing the first star being the signal to start the meal, and the meal of 12 courses, all of which was a sign that they really wanted to keep their traditions alive, even though it was pretty isolated. Her memories of that time were all good, and all what we carried through into my generation and into my children's generation. So I know the foundations were laid very early on by the first wave. So these block settlements, these were really what Ukrainians in Canada established, and we see that by 1914, by the time of the war, the First World War, they're fairly well established. The First World War was not a good experience for Ukrainians in Canada. Basically, they could not actually, most of them weren't citizens yet, but apparently 10,000 men signed up and did fight for Canada, even in the First World War. Immigration stopped, and during the war, there was the problem of some of the Ukrainian and other European immigrants being interned because they were citizens of Austria, with whom Canada was at war. So internment was an unfortunate incident. Ukrainians have never forgotten, and certainly Canada has just recently, in the last 10 or 20 years, acknowledged that. On the other hand, at the end of the war, because Ukrainians had been farmers and good farmers, they found themselves pretty well settled. Some farmers, I can name one, for example, who had purchased land, who not only settled his own land and made good, but also bought some land from his neighbors. And so by the end of the war, by the 1920s, when the second wave came, some farmers were quite prosperous. Mr. Maximets, who I knew actually, had over 1,000 acres by 1921. And his farm looked like the farm of his neighbors, with a house that was built from lumber, with barns, fences. Just you couldn't really tell the difference except for the Ukrainian features. So I'd like to then say a bit about the second wave and the push-pull factors for them. The pull was the same. Canada needed people. The railways needed to be active, to be paid for. More people on the prairies, more grain, more export, and building a society. So the second wave's push factors were a little different. They were still farm people, basically, although some were urban. They'd come through a war, a European war. There'd been a revolution and war on their land. Galicia was right in the on the borderland with the Russian Empire, so much of the fighting had happened there. They were politicized. They were people who knew who they were. They were Ukrainian. Um, they'd been learning, becoming more aware of their traditions and their identity. So they came as Ukrainians. There was no doubt that they were politically aware, and they came because of the new political situation. The part of Ukraine had gone under Soviet rule, and the part that was where Galicia was under Polish rule. And all the Polish were often intermarried with Ukrainians as political authorities of that time. They were not very sympathetic to Ukrainians. So the political situation was difficult. There was suppression of the Ukrainian language, political rights, human rights violations, cultural repression. And the people who came out of Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s were aware of the changes that were happening in Europe in between the wars. And they came to Canada with kind of highly mobilized political ideas. They were more nationalistic than the first wave. They were more urban. They certainly knew about urban life, and they came in to be with their first wave cousins. Lots of them actually were family, but they also settled more in the cities. So we have a second wave that is now urban and politicized, and we have the farmers, but they all share the same culture. Basically, they are of the same culture. They celebrate their holidays and their life cycle events in a similar manner as the first wave. And by now, the first wave is quite settled. They have now, their children have been born in Canada to some extent, are attending school, are getting educated. Education is a big priority for the first wave, and the second wave too, beyond that as well. But because they've been prevented from going on to higher schools in their European experience, there was quite a lot of pressure on the kids to do well, and they did. So we have a kind of blend of a farming population, but one which is becoming urban and becoming very accomplished in some of the traditions that they brought with them. For example, we have in the second wave in the 20s and 30s, we have dance groups that are across the country that were organized and taught by somebody whose name was Vasil Avramenko, who started dance schools across the country. We have choirs, we have mandolin orchestras, we have the beginning of art and writing literature by Ukrainian Canadians. And by 1940, by 1939, when immigration stopped again, the Ukrainian Canadian population is starting to look more like the Canadian population, the original sort of British, Scottish settlers, with professionals like doctors, pharmacists, lawyers, architects, agricultural representatives. They are making a difference in Canadian life in all the fields where they're to be found. So this is the Canada that we like to say culturally was a mosaic. They begin to form organizations across the country, women's groups, youth groups, men's groups, of course. And by 1940, just at the beginning of the war, they combined the Ukrainian population across the country, combined to be into an organization called the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, today called the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. I have to digress a little here. I haven't said much to you about their religious life, which was very central to the first wave, especially because they were villagers. They had come out of villages where the church was an important factor. And most of them in the first wave were Ukrainian Catholic, with the minority being Ukrainian Orthodox. In the period of the second wave, the Ukrainian Catholic Church itself had a new bishop and was doing well, spreading across the country. But there was a group who were kind of dissenters who wanted a church that wasn't so subordinate to Rome, and they formed a church of their own called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That was a striking event for immigration to split the way that made them split. It was unfortunate. They continued the same rituals basically as the Ukrainian Catholic Church, but the head of their church was the Eastern Christian Orthodox hierarchy based in what was then Constantinople, and later there were further splits in that church. But the fact is, there were two churches that the Ukrainians had in Canada by the end of, say, 1927. They were quite firmly established. So I want to move on quickly to the third wave. The Second World War affected Ukrainians in Canada, just as it affected everybody. A large number of Ukrainian Canadians served, 40,000 were told, and many died. Besides, the Ukrainian Canadians were very active in the war effort. They bought victory bonds. The women sewed things for the soldiers through the Red Cross. They sent parcels. They kept the home fires burning, so to speak. And when the war ended, it became obvious that there was another group of Ukrainians in Europe that needed help. These were people who had been displaced from their lands by the war. Ukraine had been the theater of war. There were huge political changes. Galicia and Bukovina, where the first and second waves had come from, were now under Soviet rule. Everybody, all the Ukrainians in Europe became located, if you like, politically under a communist administration. So the push factors for Ukrainians of the third wave were security, safety, freedom, political independence from and independence from communist rule. So they were located at first. Many of them were workers who had been Ukrainian young people who'd been sent by the German armies to work in Germany through the war. And then when the war ended and Germany had lost, these people were located all over Germany and Austria. And the United Nations established camps, displaced persons camps, which took in these people who were located in on the European lands now of Germany and Austria again, but administered by the Allies, the French, the British, Americans, and by the Soviet Union as well. I won't talk about what happened in Europe, but these DP camps were actually a sort of stopping place, a kind of a halfway house, if you like, for Ukrainians and others who were going to have to find other homes. They were refugees. They were political refugees. They could not or would not go back to homelands that were now under communist rule, and that was certainly the case of the Ukrainians. So when the DP camps and the UN started to make moves to empty out the camps, they couldn't keep them open forever in 1947. Many Ukrainians decided to come to Canada. The third wave push factors are pretty clear. The pull factors, to some extent, the fact that there were already Ukrainians in Canada, some of them had family. They were highly educated, most of them, professionals who went through a tough period in Canada in the first 5 to 10 years because their status had been changed. What we call status anxiety was a problem. They could not practice medicine or be professors at the university except if they were in Slavic studies or in Russian history. So their first 10 years or so were difficult. And they also did not have similarities with the first two waves. In some ways, the agricultural character of the first wave and the second wave and their traditions were by this time quite Canadianized. So there were disagreements, there were conflicts. Ultimately, however, they kind of agreed to disagree. And so from then until now, I would say the Ukrainian community in Canada has a highly developed Ukrainian patriotic group who still somehow cling to an idea, or did cling to the idea that Ukraine should be independent, and until it was, Ukrainians in Canada were to preserve the language and the culture. And they worked hard to do that. They developed, as I say, departments of Slavic studies. They started publications, scholarship. I'm really a product of that, of the kind of pressures that they put on the society that my parents had come from, that we had to educate. We had to get people with a higher education who could teach Canadians and teach Ukrainians about who they were, their history, their political studies, their sociology, their music. And besides that, because the third wave were so still steeped in their language and culture, they developed departments of music, or they developed their own version, I guess, of the Ukrainian Canadian culture. And at the same time, the first and second waves were bounding along with their culture, this new integrated mosaic culture. We have now new artists, we have dance groups, we have less and less Ukrainian culture that depends on the language. So what can we say about the the third wave's influence. I would say um, their change, the way they changed Ukrainian Canadian culture was to um, to make it more um, acceptable to them, which is that there would be more Ukrainian language spoken. There would be organizations like Plast, which emphasized Ukrainian language and culture. There would be the singing of the say the liturgical music. They kind of gave to the existing Ukrainian Canadian population a little bit more kind of high culture with because of their knowledge of the Ukrainian language and their political backgrounds. They had come to Canada very highly political and determined to have an independent Ukraine one day. Then, for many years still to come, there was not an independent Ukraine. So through the 50s and 60s and 70s and beyond, Ukrainians in Canada became more aware of the problems in Ukraine and were very excited when in 1989, 90, 91, a new politician in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, you all know him, started to talk about changing the Soviet Union. And once he started talking about changing, the ethnic groups of the Soviet Union were ready for more than just a small change. And Ukrainians under the Soviet system were among the first to break away from the bigger Soviet system and establish an independent Ukraine in 1991. Canada was one of the first countries to acknowledge, I think it was the very first to acknowledge the independence of Ukraine in 1991. And the pressure on Ukrainians in Canada to somehow rescue or help Ukraine to survive and its culture was reduced tremendously. So since the 1990s, I can say the culture of Ukrainians in Canada has become much more Canadianized, although the traditions are still all there. We have painters and we have artists, we have musicians, we have politicians, people at the very highest levels of our society. I'll just mention a few for kind of orientation. Krista Freeland is the daughter of an immigrant Ukrainian. Who else? Oh, Wayne Gretzky. His grandparents are Ukrainian. Alex Trebek, who just recently passed away, was a Ukrainian Canadian from Sudbury. And I could go on. There's a lot. Ukrainians have also in Canada played a huge role in developing what we have now. I think we have for decades now multiculturalism as a policy, and I think the continued influence of Ukrainians in all fields is going to be evident, and you can tell what's Ukrainian by opening your newspapers or television during January, the month of celebration, colorful music, costumes, food that are a continuation of what came with the first wave. And I think if you're around in 20 years, they're going to talk about a fourth wave.